October 25, 1994, in Lexington, Kentucky, the police killing of 18-year-old Tony Sullivan would ignite the city, amidst a national conversation about race, police brutality, and accountability. Tony Sullivan was just 18 years old, living in the Bluegrass Aspendale housing project. Described by his friends as outgoing and full of life, his tragic death would leave a void in his community that could never be filled. On the morning of October 25, police officers arrived to arrest Tony. During the confrontation, Lexington Police Sergeant Phil Vogel's gun discharged, fatally striking Tony in the head. The officer later claimed it was an accident, and witnesses said Tony had his hands up at the time. Word of Tony's death spread quickly, and by that afternoon, outrage consumed the streets. Anger turned to action as more than 100 youths, primarily young black men, took to the streets. The protesters hurled rocks, bottles, and Molotov cocktails at police officers. Windows were shattered, cars were damaged, and even news vehicles were flipped over. The heart of downtown Lexington became a battleground. Demands for justice echoed through the city. Protesters stormed City Hall demanding accountability and answers. But for many, the explanation of an accidental shooting was simply not enough. Tony Sullivan's death was not an isolated incident. Across the country, tensions between black communities and police forces had been building for decades. In Lexington, this shooting became the tipping point. For many in the community, Tony's death was yet another example of systemic racism within law enforcement. At the time, black communities across the country were fighting back against what they saw as a pattern of excessive force and unequal treatment by police. Tony's death was symbolic of a much larger issue, one that Lexington couldn't ignore any longer. In the weeks that followed, the community awaited the grand jury's decision on whether Sergeant Phil Vogel would be indicted for Tony Sullivan's death. Many hoped that justice would be served, that the officer responsible for taking a young life would face consequences. But in the end, the grand jury declined to indict Vogel, ruling the shooting an accident. Vogel retired from the police force soon after. For the community, this was not just a legal decision, it was a moral failure. Witnesses claimed Tony had his hands up in surrender when the fatal shot was fired. These testimonies fueled further protests, but the legal outcome remained unchanged. Though the protests eventually quieted, the pain from Tony Sullivan's death never fully went away. For many in Lexington, it remains a symbol of injustice, a moment when the system failed.